Hi, interest students. This is a lecture titled Painting's Problems and how this helps us understand now. And so in previous lectures, I've alluded to this idea of us getting into kind of historical moments and thinking about specifically modernity in this 18th to 19th century into World War I arena because of how significant the changes culturally and socially and economically, how everything was changing so rapidly and so quickly, and painting specific, being, between sculpture and painting, but painting more abstractly, divorces itself or moves away from its long history of representation and does it in a very radical way. Sculpture does as well, but I think it's a little bit not easier, but a little bit how do I put it? Painting is just so big in terms of subject and all the contributions that it's really nice to use as a vehicle for understanding some of these shifts and changes. So I'm going to lecture on that because I think it's going to help us understand some of the more contemporary stuff that we've already been talking about and some of the things that I think are more challenging at the moment for the public in general. So up until the early 20th century, art had been dedicated to this idea of copying visual appearances in various media. So you see here on the left the Mona Lisa, which is a painting, two-dimensional, and on the right the sculptural representation, right, of David. And it's really important for us to notice that dedication to copying visual appearance. And I know that probably sounds fairly obvious, but it doesn't always seem obvious, its relationship to the shifts we've seen over the last 100+ years. So the Renaissance artist, Alberti, from a text called On Painting, wrote, "There should be no visual difference between looking at a painting or looking out at a window at what the painting shows. Thus, a successful portrait should be indiscernible from seeing the subject of the portrait looking at us through a window." And so the idea of the metric and the goal being that type of simulacra between the real world and your real experience of looking out the window and looking at the painting or artwork itself is significant. So the art of painting, also known as the allegory of painting or Painter in his Studio, famous painting. This illusionistic painting is one of Vermeer's most famous. Vermeer is, remember, the artist that was referenced in Paul Bloom's lecture about the forgery. Albert Alpers describes it as unique and ambitious. It describes it as a virtuoso display of the artist's power of invention and execution, staged in an imaginary version of his studio, according to Blankert here. No other painting so flawlessly integrates naturalistic technique, brightly illuminated space, and a complexly integrated composition. So we're just hashing out some of these metrics by which paintings or artworks are deemed good, right? Or worthy. So this is Michael Fried on the modernist painting, okay, and this is where we're going to shift. Roughly speaking, the history of painting from Manet to synthetic cubism and Matisse may be characterized in some terms, in terms of the gradual withdrawal of painting from the task of representing reality, or of reality from the power of painting to represent it, in favor of an increasing preoccupation with problems intrinsic to painting itself. And it's really nice that he shows that shift of reality from the power of painting to represent it, because that acknowledges modernism, right? Or modernity. Okay, this condition. This is a philosophical turn, which also makes painting inaccessible, right? And we'll talk about why. So pulling away from institutions, Western modernist paintings pulling away from representation is happening as a more general pulling away from the institutions that support them. To critique the systems of these institutions meant a deeper critique of the mode of representation, not just the subject matter. Okay, so you're not just saying I don't agree with the premise or the ideology of these institutions. I don't agree how they utilize and that metric by which they measure what's deemed worthy of representation. So, context, right? Think of the context of this time, and I know I'm bringing up a lot of men, so I apologize, but these are the ways that this history is re-represented, so I want to show some of that, and then we'll dive into those kind of movements that push up against and fringe some of these ideologies. So we have on our economic sphere Karl Marx, right, who's presenting alternative economic models to what's becoming the more prevalent capitalist structures. We've got Nietzsche, who's thinking in terms of our belief in God, right, in philosophic terms, and he's saying that, you know, God is dead, or that our faith in a higher power is unnecessary because of that self-determination, right? And Sigmund Freud is in our psychological sphere, kind of thinking about our subconscious and thinking about the things that motivate us without us understanding or knowing them fully, or that they're moving us without rational thought. Okay, we're in this push toward World War I. So this is, if you're thinking back to Duchamp and you're thinking about that time period, you're thinking about 1914 to 18 is World War I, and to really understand World War I, I'm a little bit of an nut when it comes to thinking about World War I, because I think it's just so impactful. It's a turning point in humanity where I still think we're reeling from the damage it caused, but you think about the shifts, the rapid shifts in technology at the time. So at the time, at the beginning of the war, you think of the British, and the British having what would arguably be the largest, most powerful imperialistic fleet of ships and naval forces in the world. And the Germans at the time, when they attack Western Europe, they attack that fleet and attack the fleet with metal submarines and boats. So the wooden ships that of that time period are completely decimated within months. That entire armada is gone, right? At the time the Germans invaded, I think through Belgium into France, they arrived, and the French were wearing the same bright blue uniforms with feathers coming out of their hats that they been wearing since Napoleon, and they were considered the strongest land army in the world. And the Germans come in wearing the gray and camouflage-like uniforms and just decimate the army of the French. So you see the machine gun, you see this mechanized warfare, all these advents that come out of this period are pretty wild, right? Including the willingness to destroy large swaths of people and land. So this kind of growing suspicion, right? Marx and others are part of a movement that is very suspicious of industrialization and growing technologies, taking a good look at what humans are capable of doing to each other with these industrialized tools, how this shapes our lives, or rather how it alienates or compartmentalizes them. And so this idea of, if our faith in these institutions brought us to World War I, something's wrong. Okay, these institutions aren't headed in the correct or right direction. Right, so we see this mechanized labor. What does this say about our social and societal values? Here's a really nice video that I want you to watch. Okay,
on alienation.
I'll have you guys watch that yourself. Mainly because I'm not sure in this video if I have the audio, but go ahead and make sure you watch that video. Actually, let me see if I don't think you can, but I'm gonna try to see if my mic can pick it up. So I'll increase the volume.
Karl Marx on alienation. Karl Marx believed that work, at its best, is what makes us human. It fulfills our species' essence, as he put it. Work allows us to live, to be creative, to flourish. However, the reality in 19th century Europe was that work destroyed workers, particularly those who had nothing to sell but their labor. To the mill and factory owners, a worker was simply an abstract idea with a stomach that needed to be filled. The workers had no choice but to toil long hours for a pitiful wage. What was worse, their labor alienated them. Alienation is a disorienting sense of exclusion and separation. Factory labor, under capitalism, alienated the workers from the product of their labor. They made stuff they couldn't afford to buy, which disappeared to shops in far-off places, to make money for people who paid them next to nothing. The factory production line split jobs into meaningless tasks that made the hours at work tedious, empty, and bleak. They became cogs in a gigantic machine. Workers lived for the few hours at home when they could eat, sleep, and relax. The rest of the time, they weren't fully alive. This work also alienated them from each other. The only way out of this drudgery, Marx argued, was for the workers to organize and revolt. They needed to seize the means of production, leading to his famous rallying cry, "Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains."
Good, but bleak in a lot of ways in terms of that time. So not to rush through that, but we have a lot to address in terms of painting's problems. So photography comes on the scene generally in 1893 in its first public demonstration of mechanized photography, and we have Daguerre. He's a French artist and photographer who made daguerreotypes, and early photography was completely commercial. It was just for portraits and for commercial means. But you see early, right, this very long exposure shows, this is really nice, a gentleman who had stood long enough having his shoes shine on a busy street. So this is really crowded, and there's tons of people and probably horses and wagons going by, but because it's such a long exposure, you can't see any. It's a 10-minute exposure, so the only human frozen was someone who was sitting still for that long. 1839, you get what might be called the first self-portrait or selfie. So via painting, the creator constructs the painting from the visual, whereas photography almost seems to remove the construction. In other words, it removes the subjectivity to an extent. Photography is mechanized, a machine, just as the locomotive, the printing press, etc. Time is compressed to moments rather than larger or longer painted time. Right? And so you see this scientific dehumanizing. It's more objective maybe than painting. It's more quote unquote realistic. Right? You have Lincoln on the battlefield, Antietam. Whether or not it's staged or not, or set up and constructed in that way, when we think about painting and its comparison to photography, you think about that subjectivity. In the painting of Lincoln on the right, it has Lincoln kind of airbrushed and smoothed out. It's like a bad Instagram filter or something. And on the right is the much kind of harsher truth, right? The nature, the natural is revealed in a lot of ways through photography. So from 1800 on, painting is in a bit of a identity crisis. Now, this helps expand what Greenberg, and we're going to bring up Greenberg. I'm sorry, I kind of allude to him here because we're going to have a whole lecture on him. That's pointing to reasons why painting starts to question what it does, this identity crisis, right? Especially in the face of something like photography, which represents the world better than painting can. This motivates painting to ask, what is it for, right? What can painting do that photography can't? And so you get this development shortly after the development of photography, and it's not a coincidence. So we're gonna kind of split this into two variants. We're gonna use post-impressionism, this kind of time period. You have Vincent van Gogh on the left and Cézanne on the right, and these kind of two train of thoughts or two approaches to those identity questions and where painting heads. So Starry Night, oil and canvas, we get this abstract. It's not like a photograph. It's very subjective. It's an expression, right? Van Gogh's answer is painting is a thoroughly human response to the world. Against the mechanized camera lens used by a human, a mechanized eye, where Van Gogh takes in the world and processes it through all the messy psychology and let the painting, let that into the painting. He put it into the painting. It's a human construction. It's human made. It's subjective, an emotional response to how he sees, right? Or how it sees, not what he sees, but how he sees becomes about his encounter with the world. So this expressionism is an emotional activity of the artist, becomes more and more prominent, right? Not what the world looks like, but how it's inhabited by humans, how it feels from the inside, especially in a time marked by alienation and conflict. So we get Kandinsky, who's a really interesting figure. He's making abstract representations of music or sound. This has a lot to do with, he has synesthesia, actually, which is interesting. He hears color, okay? Edvard Munch, Cath Colfitz, right? You see the war-torn. You get the narrative, Max Beckmann, and the abstract mythologies. The Dream by Marc Chagall, The Birthday, right? The subconscious here. Now the other route, the structuralist route, this is the Cezanne. The other non-expressionistic emotional response to photography is via Cezanne. This is the route that Greenberg is going to pick up on, that we're going to talk about. Much more philosophical in meaning. What is painting for? What can it do? So post-impressionism here, is it a landscape or is it an object? Right? Is it a canvas? Right? A flat surface hung on the wall or placed on a wall? Or is it both simultaneously? Is it that kind of landscape and an object? What painting can be that photography can at this point is maybe something that can analyze these questions, something that can take apart language like a linguist might, draw attention to the language and the structure that it communicates, right? The language and structure that painting communicates. Painting can be self-consciously linguistic, taking apart how it conveys and carries meaning. So Cezanne, it's really nice to see it when it's an object on the wall. I want you to watch this video on the right. I'm not going to play it right now. It's a little bit of a discussion about cubism and the abstraction that Pablo Picasso and actually another gentleman, Barth, bring forward. But this is called The Young Ladies of Avignon. And the kind of subject matter is one thing, right? But also the way that space is approached, that kind of subjective perspective. So this is if you're imagining Picasso standing in front of the subject, these models, he is moving around them and painting as he's moving around them. So he's painting on the same single two-dimensional surface, multiple perspectives of how he looked at these figures in this space, okay, and collapsing that. So he's really trying to capture motion. Okay, right? This is Duchamp, Nude Descending a Staircase. So you see that motion happening, 1912, and trying to capture that. Abstraction, forms on a flat surface, right? We see abstraction. This is kind of that logical conclusion out of Cezanne and out of Van Gogh, potentially. This is Pierre Mondrian composition in brown and gray, 1913. Right, these have meaning. There are actual ideologies and theories, actually, or manifestos about why these are constructed this way, and they have kind of social and political implications about the grid, about how we structure our environments, and it has a lot of things to say in that. So this response to photography, we see in Expressionism, that kind of individualistic emotional response, and then the analytic philosophic response. Okay, Expressionism, structuralism, both lead us to abstraction. Okay, they both make their route to that. So that we had this beginning with these two forms that then culminate in what would be abstract expressionism. Okay, and that's how we get to someone like Jackson Pollock that we're going to use in our next lecture to really hone in on where painting goes with some of these questions, and how it's kind of how it's answered some of those questions, right? Make sure that you go through, some of this is, I know, a little bit more abstract and complicated, but I'm going to do my best to try to convey this, especially through this kind of media. Okay.